Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really honored to be at this symposium honoring Alfred Russel Wallace, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to digress a minute from my story, pursuing all the birds of paradise with Ed, tell you a little bit about sort of a personal connection I have with Wallace, because he really helped inspire me to first go to the tropics. I was a student at Harvard, and looking around, I was getting interested in tropical biology and looking for opportunities to get some experience in the tropics. And I was in the biology building. I saw this poster in the hall with this picture on the left from the Malay Archipelago as the sort of, catching image that caught my eye. And it said, wanted field assistance for rainforest research in Borneo. See Professor Layton. So I was intrigued, and I went to see Professor Layton, and he told me about his research study on frugivorous, fruit-eating birds and mammals in Borneo. He was looking for field assistants to go there for a whole year and work at his field station, collecting data for him. And so I thought that sounded pretty interesting. I said, but I wanted to learn more about Borneo. I didn't know that much about Borneo. And I said, well, Professor Layton, what can I read? Can you recommend anything that I can get some more information about this area? And he said, go read Wallace, the Malay Archipelago. So I went to the library, the biolabs at Harvard. I found on the shelf an 1890 copy, 100-year-old copy of the Malay Archipelago. Hadn't been checked out very much. You can see that Wallace wasn't quite as popular as Darwin, but I checked it out. I went home and read that, and to make a long story short, I signed up to go work with Professor Layton in Borneo. And so during my first year working there as a research assistant in this beautiful rainforest in western Borneo in a place called Gunung Palung National Park, I really became fascinated with tropical rainforest biology, and I decided to continue my studies in that field and go back and do my PhD working in the rainforest in Indonesia. And so as I tried to think about what to do my PhD on, one of the things that I got really fascinated about during that first year in Borneo were these trees called strangler fig trees, and this incredible web of life surrounding the figs, all the animals that fed on them. And I wanted to study more about how these fig trees got started up in the canopy. And it's interesting that throughout my work in this part of the world, I keep finding that I've somehow gotten this inspiration back from Wallace. This is an illustration of a tree that Wallace appears in the Malay Archipelago on the left there. And here's a tree that I found that could have been a perfect model for the Wallace's image that I found in not a place that Wallace visited in Ferguson Island in PNG, but I think the same species of fig. So I ended up doing a PhD project on strangler figs. I did a lot of tree climbing. I studied how figs colonize their host trees and all the wildlife that dispersed fig seeds. But that also really was my entree into serious wildlife photography. I wanted to document I'd always been interested in photography, but I wanted to document my research. And I was doing this tree climbing and having great access to wildlife up in the canopy, and gave me a chance to capture some pretty unique images that I was able to catch the eye of editors at National Geographic with, who would also help to support my research. So then I went on to kind of start doing more and more wildlife photography and started pitching ideas to National Geographic, most of which seemed to have come out of the Malay Archipelago somehow, like a story on the gliding animals of Borneo. So of course I'd read about Wallace's flying frog, and I thought, well, I've got to find that frog and photograph it. So I figured out where I could find that frog. There's my photograph there on the right, and of course Wallace had drawn it gliding, so I wanted to get the shot of it gliding as well, and I managed to get this image of the frog gliding down to this pig wallow where they lay eggs and breed. And so, the Malay Archipelago has been just an endless source of inspiration, of interesting topics in natural history to pursue and tell stories about throughout the last 20 years of my life. And of course, one of those subjects, of course, is orangutans. And it just so happens that I met a graduate student at Harvard named Cheryl Knott, who is now my wife, became my wife many years ago, and we worked together in the field. She was a primatologist working on orangutans, so I started documenting orangutans as well, and have done quite a lot of work photographing orangutans for the Geographic, and actually spent this past summer in Borneo with Cheryl and our kids at her research site working on orangutans and documenting them for a new National Geographic project. So right now, I've sort of moved on to a phase of really working intensively on orangutans again. But I now want to kind of go back to the birds of paradise and tell you, kind of pick up where Ed left off, tell you about some of the other locations that we went to across this amazing Indonesian archipelago in the footsteps of Wallace. And one of the real highlights for Wallace was his discovery, that's already been alluded to a couple times today, of this species, Wallace's standard wing, which is named after him. And this is video that we shot in the wild in Halmahera Island where he discovered the species. And this was, one of his great prizes, as he said, a new species of bird of paradise. And as you can see, it's a bizarre bird. So we've seen this map on the left a couple times today. This is a kind of a close-in section of that map from the Malay Archipelago showing all the lines of Wallace's journeys to the different islands. And today I'm going to take you to Halmahera, where the Wallace's standard wing is found and where we went in Wallace's footsteps there. I'm going to take you to Waigeo Island, which you see just off the northern, just north of the very western tip of the big island of New Guinea, where he went to search for red bird of paradise, and then down to the Aru Islands, where he caught the king bird of paradise that you saw, that Ed showed at the very beginning of his talk, and also the greater bird of paradise. So first to Ternate and Halmahera, up here in the upper left part of the map, the Spice Islands. You can probably imagine Wallace's excitement as he first approached on a sailing vessel these volcanic cones, these famous volcanic cones of Ternate and Tidore in the Spice Islands. These are the capital of the spice trade. This is the harbor in Ternate as it looks today, but the photograph is taken from a fort built by the Portuguese in 1520. And so Wallace certainly walked up to this fort when he lived there. This was Wallace's kind of base of operations, this village on Ternate. He had a house that's just off the screen to the right that he rented for some months and used as his base as he went off on these boat voyages to different islands. And as we have traveled around this region, we keep encountering things from the Malay Archipelago. And for example, Wallace illustrated not only natural history but many of the cultural aspects of life in this region. On the left here, you see his illustration of the techniques for processing sago. This is the kind of heart of this large palm that is the sort of staple carbohydrate, staple starch for many people in this region. And they process it using parts of the palm tree they grind up the pulp and then rinse it and then let it settle out. And on the right, you see my photograph from 2007 in Waigeo Island, where you can see the exact same design of the sago processing machinery or technology from 150 years ago. So not a big improvement or a big change in sago processing technology in the last 150 years. Although, of course, in other regards, these areas changing a lot, and we see a lot of changes going on. But at least in some of these elements, it's just fascinating to see how similar things still are to the time when Wallace was there. Now, you saw in the little video about our Birds of Paradise project by the numbers. We had a lot of boat trips around this area, and as Jared alluded to this morning, out of our 58 boat trips, I think we were pretty lucky. Only 2 times did our boats break down and we were sort of adrift at sea without a motor. And this is one of those boats. Actually, this is one of the ones that broke down. It had a small motor in it, but it went out on us and we were just adrift. But fortunately, it was a calm day, and we would have been in a bit of trouble if bad weather had come up while our boatman tried to get the motor working again while we were going between parts of Halmahera. So we traveled around, in these kind of boats, not that different from Wallace's time, except for with the advantage of motors that occasionally worked. And we went to many beautiful lowland forests. This is lowland forest in Halmahera, where we were searching for that Wallace's standard wing. And actually, it was in Halmahera where we stayed in a hut. We were offered a little hut by our local guide there, which you can see on the right. And I just had to pair it up with this slide, Wallace's illustration of his hut that you also saw earlier today, because it was so similar. And this was not intentionally modeled after Wallace's hut. This was just like the actual hut we were offered to stay in. I think Wallace's actually was a little bit better made. It actually had walls on the upstairs sleeping area where we just hung up our mosquito nets and tried to keep the mosquitoes away while we slept. But our target was this Wallace's standard wing, a truly bizarre bird. Its sort of salient feature being these bizarre plumes that come out of the bird's wrists, those white feathers that you see sticking up there. And as I said, Wallace was super excited to capture this bird, and he knew it was a brand new species, and correctly it recognized that even though it looked very different from any other birds of paradise, he could tell from the beak, the feet, the other features, even though the plumage is very different, he could recognize that it was in the bird of paradise family. So it has this is the display where it spreads its wings out and bounces and fans out its cravat in quite spectacular fashion. Now, we also encountered while in Halmahera, we had a chance to see some of the other species that also Wallace discovered and which were described, including the ornate cuscus, a marsupial that's unique to Halmahera, and one of my favorite bird names in the world, the invisible rail, which actually it's pretty much invisible. It's very hard to see, but we were lucky in that some boys in the village had actually accidentally captured one in the sort of noose trap that they set out just to try to catch the sort of free-range chickens around the village, and they'd accidentally snared this invisible rail, so we got to see one. But, thinking back on Wallace's time in Halmahera and what the conditions that he lived under, here's Ed in one of our field camps as it's like pouring rain, and we usually were in these tent camps or maybe if we found a little bush hut that we could stay in. We lived in those places for weeks at a time and ate rice and noodles or whatever we could get. But we had it pretty easy compared to Wallace. As Jared said this morning, we had anti-malarial drugs and we had proper mosquito nets and all kinds of things that he didn't have. And we're just trying to survive and get some good observations on these birds. And if he was in these conditions, it was here in Halmahera where he, in a bout of malarial fever, had the insight to the process of natural selection. And he scribbled his notes for his letter to Darwin at a field camp, perhaps something like this, in Halmahera there. So I just found it amazing that he was able to, do that kind of intellectual, creative thinking, while in these kind of field conditions. And then it was when he went back to his whole sort of home base in Ternate that he wrote up his letter to Darwin that you've heard about, and sent that off, which is known as the letter from Ternate. But he actually, if you look at his journals, he actually came up with the idea while he was in a camp in Halmahera Island. Now, one of the other places I want to take you to in Wallace's footsteps is the island of Waigeo. You see on Wallace's sketch map, it's at the very top there. This is one of those arduous sailing journeys, and in fact, one of those little islands on the way up on his line is the one where Gerard Diamond this morning mentioned he had to drop off two of his men because they couldn't land, or they couldn't get into the, and then by the time he was going to pick them up, he'll have been stranded there for a month. But anyway, you see at the top, his dotted line goes up to Waigeo, and it goes through a passage between Waigeo and a little island there called Gemion, which is now called Gam. And in my photograph on the right, I photographed that passage, that narrow passage that separates these two islands. And Wallace, I especially wanted to go to this spot and travel through there by boat, and also to fly in a little ultralight plane that I was able to fly with a local pilot there who had an ultralight to get these photographs. Especially want to do that because I was always impressed by Wallace's description of this place. And here's how he described it. So for the first time, he came to this region for the first time through that strait from the other side, kind of coming down toward the bottom of the picture to where you see those islands. Okay, and here's the view, looking out as you're coming through. And he describes in the Malay Archipelago, he says, "We emerged into what seemed like a lake, but was in fact a deep gulf." That's what you see right there, studded along its shores with numbers of rocky islets. Every islet was covered with strange-looking shrubs and trees, and was generally crowned by the lofty and elegant palms, forming one of the most singular and picturesque landscapes I have ever seen. So I really want to make this sort of pilgrimage to find that spot and photograph it. I'm happy to, have a chance to share that with you today. So this is one of those spots that Wallace just found so striking in his travels in the Malay Archipelago. Now, my first trip to Waigeo was actually way back in 1990 when I was a grad student, sort of on a birdwatching trip, and that's when I saw my first bird of paradise. And at that time, this is a shot from a village. This is a village that Wallace visited. It's on his map. And at that time, I didn't see any plastic or metal. All these dugouts are made out of local materials. And things have started changing a little bit in this region, of course. This is a more recent photo from a couple years ago of the village of Bessir, or Yen Bessir. This is actually the village that Wallace based himself at for several months while he collected and observed the redbird of paradise. And I'm pretty sure that they were using canoes exactly like the one that gentleman there is using to fish for his lunch from when Wallace was there. Now you see a few tin roofs, a few cement foundations on the houses, and the one other difference was that occasionally this guy would reach into his pocket and pull out his cell phone to answer a text message from his wife, who was probably saying have you got those fish for lunch yet? Come on, hurry, kids are getting hungry. So things are changing there, but still, you can still get the sense of what was like when Wallace was there. And so his big goal there, as was ours, was to see this bird, the redbird of paradise. And one of the really spectacular birds of paradise, it happens to display at the top of it chooses as its display site the top of the tallest tree in the area. So this was a particularly challenging shot to get. I had to climb. This is where I built the sort of tallest blind that I ever built. I measured it with my rope. It was 50 meters or 165 feet from the ground up to the place where I constructed a small blind and photographed the display site of this redbird of paradise. And you see this bird has some really striking, sort of unusual tail feathers, these two black ones that just kind of are in these curly cues coming down on the side of his tail there. And one of the great things things that we really wanted to do was to document, as Ed mentioned with some other examples, how are these plumes used in their displays. And in this example, you can see that you don't really see what they do here, but when the bird turns upside down into its sort of display pose, where it displays to the female, you see how these black tail wires form this perfect arc around the body, sort of framing the whole bird. And so only when you see the bird in its correct attitude of display do you understand how the plumes sort of work or operate in the display. Now, one of the other birds that lives in this same island there of Waigeo is the Wilson's bird of paradise. Now, I think this is one that Wallace probably really wishes he would have found, because somehow, even though he was there for a couple months, he never observed the species. It wasn't described until some years later by another naturalist. But this is another one of the birds of paradise found in that group of islands there, and it's very interesting for its obviously striking coloration, but also behavior. It has a court similar to the parodias that Ed showed, and the females of this species are judging the male not only based on his striking appearance, but also on how neatly he takes care of his court. So every morning he has to come down. If any leaves have fallen during the night, and that's what he's doing here. He's cleaning his court off. He's clearing off any leaves and making sure it's perfectly neat. So she also has this beautiful call to try to lure in the females, and then just has this, these striking colors and this curly-Q tail to impress the females with. And one of the most unusual things is this blue skull cap, this bare skin on his head, that is especially unique in the Wilson's bird of paradise. So those are two species that are unique to the island of Waigeo. But now just south of there, a bit further to the south, are the Aru Islands. And this is the place that Wallace knew was the source of the greater bird of paradise. The greater bird of paradise is the species that actually was the first bird of paradise named by Linnaeus. It was the first bird of paradise to reach Europe, and actually reached Europe on one of Magellan's ships that made the first circumnavigation, and picked up those specimens in that port of Ternate I showed you in the Spice Islands as a gift. So Wallace knew that there was this ancient trade route from the Moluccas up to the northwest, down to the Aru Islands, and he traveled on that trade route to the Aru Islands and spent months there to try to go in the field and get specimens of the greater bird of paradise. And so Ed and I really wanted to sort of follow in his footsteps and make a pilgrimage there to see them in that same region that Wallace saw them, because this is also the species that he was the first Western naturalist to observe the display behavior of the greater bird of paradise. It was the first one that he really saw displaying in the wild. Others, his hunters maybe brought in, but this one was the one that he really described and saw displaying. And so the Aru Islands are a fascinating kind of limestone uplift with these channels, and you see on the right a little time lapse of us traveling on these channels. you see on Wallace's sketch map, he's got these dotted lines showing where he went up through these different channels into the interior. And that's what we did to an area very close to where Wallace was in the central part of the Aru archipelago, where we had some local guides, some local landowners who had been protecting a particular patch of forest with greater birds of paradise and invited us to come and see them there. So we took this boat up the channel until we got too shallow for the boat. We moved all our gear over into this smaller boat because the guy said, oh, we can go a little bit farther if we get the stuff into this smaller boat, because nobody was looking forward too much to carrying all this gear into the camp. But this is, typical of what we did. And then we with a bunch of assistance from the local guys, we would, carry everything in and set up a camp, and then go out and scout the location. And in this case, these local guys already knew where the tree was. They had this, okay, we know a tree where these birds are displaying. That kind of made our job easy. But when I got there, I saw that birds are way up in the tree. These are the greater birds of paradise. This is what we were after. This is what Wallace was after. I knew I was going to have to make a blind up in the canopy, to photograph them from up above. I didn't want to be shooting up from below. And so I told these local men, okay, well, I want to climb up a tree and put up a blind. And they said, well, how are you going to do that? And I said, well, I know how to do this. I have ropes, and I have some camouflage cloth I'm going to cover myself with up there, and I'm going to take pictures up there. And they said, oh, that's not going to work. And I said, well, I've done this before. It kind of usually works pretty well. And they're like, no, that's not going to work. They said, we've been our ancestors, our dads and our grandfathers have been hunting these birds. We've stopped hunting them, but we know how to hunt them, and we know what works with these birds. And there's a certain way you have to build a blind, or they won't come. So I said, okay, well, that's fine. I decided to, let's go. I'll go with the program. If you guys can help me make this blind. So they climbed up. They just free climbed the trees up into the canopy. I used my ropes, and I got up there with them and helped choose the spot where we had the best view. But then they proceeded to assemble this platform just with some poles that their friends were cutting at the ground and then tying it together with vines. And I said, well, I've got some rope. We can tie this together with ropes. And they said, no. If we use ropes, the birds won't come. You can only tie everything together with vines. So I was like, okay, all right, whatever you say. And then they were putting the floor in, and it was not very big. I said, I'd like a little more space because I want to bring out my tripod and everything. And they said, no, we can only use 12 sticks for the floor. Any more than 12 sticks, and the birds won't come. And I said, okay, I didn't really know birds of paradise could count, but I said, okay, well, don't want to ruffle any feathers here, so to speak. Let's just spread out those poles a little bit, those sticks, so that I have a little more space, and that's why I have some gaps in my floor there. But they thatched this structure with palm leaves, and there you see on the right the beautiful final product. And I had to admit, it was a much nicer looking blind than I could have built, or would have with my camouflage cloth. And so the next day, of course, we did this during the middle of the day when the birds were not around. So we always do, and the birds are coming in the early morning. So the next day, I was up in that blind, before it got light. I climbed up in the dark, got my camera set up, and when it started to get light, the birds arrived, and this is what I saw. So as you can see, there were two adult males there. This is called a lek. This is a site where multiple males display together. And there was a couple females there, some younger males flying around. And one of the really interesting things about the display of this species is there's a phase where the males kind of freeze in this pose, head down, and they just allow the females to come and have a very close look at them, And so Wallace, he observed this behavior as well. So he was the first Western naturalist to see these birds displaying in the wild, and he wrote about it, effusively in the Malay Archipelago. And, he even said that, of course, as we've heard many times, he was making his living by collecting specimens, and he did collect specimens there. But he also appreciated the value of the scientific observations he was making. And so what he said was, what I valued almost as much as the birds themselves was the knowledge of their habits, And so that's what Ed and I wanted to do. We wanted to go beyond and keep gathering more information about these birds' habits because, it's remarkable in this day and age, but, there's still all these birds of paradise out there in the New Guinea region, and many of them, we know very little about their habits. We were just beginning to really unravel the mysteries of their displays. But Wallace wrote about this species. He said, when seen in this attitude, the bird of paradise really deserves its name and must be ranked as one of the most beautiful and most wonderful of living things. And I certainly have to agree, and I was really happy with the photographs I was getting of this blind. I spent several days climbing this tree in the dark and shooting with different lenses and shooting stills and shooting video, and they were very reliably coming every morning. It was just a really, really amazing location once we got there and gotten this all set up. And so, of course, I was really pleased with the results I was getting, but I also had this image in the back of my mind that I've been dreaming about for many years as we worked on the birds of paradise. Is I wanted to get a photograph that showed the bird of paradise, in its habitat. It's so hard to do because I was always hiding in blinds and using telephoto lenses. And I realized that this tree was uniquely positioned. It was kind of on a hill. The birds were displaying right in the top where it was kind of open and looking out over the landscape, and I thought, if I could somehow get a camera, really close to the birds up there with a wide-angle lens, I could maybe get that dream shot I've been thinking of. But I knew I couldn't build a blind right there next to them. They would never come if I was that close. And so, I had this idea to go up in their tree and check it out.
I'm in the luck tree right now.
This is a little camera on my head as I climbed up into the tree where the birds were displaying after they had left for the day.
All right. Here's the lek right here. See these branches right here? This is the main display perch and the secondary perch there. And there's my blind over there where I've been shooting from. And right here.
See, I'd actually been up there that morning in the dark and I'd hidden this camera. So this was my attempt to get the camera up close to the birds. And I'd hidden this camera in these leaves. I'd mounted it there to the tree, and I'd strung a cable from this tree over to the other tree so that I could actually control that camera remotely. Using these modern tools is really fantastic. It gives you some great opportunities. And so here's my setup. I had this camera hidden there, wrapped in the leaves, hoping the birds wouldn't notice it. And so what I had to do is I climbed up in the dark, set up that camera early in the morning, about 4 in the morning. I went back down, over to the other tree. I climbed up the other tree, carried my laptop in a case, and this is up in my blind. Inside my blind, I opened up my case, I plugged in my laptop to that camera and turned everything on and hoped that everything was working. Okay? And this time it actually was working, and as it started to get light, I heard the birds coming, so I started to record this video. Yes, you see the two males were there. There were a couple of females around, and then, amazingly, one of the females gave the signal that she was interested in going on to the next stage, the sort of signal that she wanted to mate, flicking her wings. So this got the male to go into the final stage of his courtship, which is to tap the female on the neck and make this little sound. So that sound only occurs, just in the preceding mating. So if you're ever in the rainforest of New Guinea and you hear that sound, you know what's about to happen. So that's a pretty good way to start your day if you're a male bird of paradise. But as a photographer, I was still I was real excited to be recording this behavior, on video. I was like, this is awesome, but look, I want some light here. I need this, when's the sun going to come out? And then just a minute or two later, the sun suddenly popped out from behind a cloud, and so I switched my camera over to still mode, and I took this photograph here. So I think Wallace would have appreciated that, and I'll leave you with that today. Thank you very much.